Welcome to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. Great to have you here with us. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve at Church of the Pacific Northwest, and today I'm in New England, in Connecticut, in the same time zone as Tom and Glenn, although Tom and I are in Connecticut, and Glenn is somewhere else out in the Midwest. Anyway, I am a writer, and I'm also a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. Okay, let's go to you, Tom. Tell us about yourself.
I'm Tom Price. I too am in Connecticut and pretty much here all the time. This great, nice gray area today. And I teach theology and Christian ethics at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. I serve as a minister, and I also write and speak.
Great. Okay, Glenn, it's your show, so why don't you fill us in on what we're talking about?
Okay, I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am in Granger, Indiana, just outside of South Bend, about 15 minutes from Notre Dame, where we're in the middle of a snowstorm that's expected to drop between 6 and 12 inches, locally heavier at other spots. So it's exciting. I'm a professor emeritus of history at Central Connecticut State University. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I've got my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries at eastsquareinch.org. And I am working on multiple books right now. I've got 3 going, 2 of them with collaborators, 1 on my own. And along with that, I write a lot on Substack. So that's me.
All right.
Okay, the topic for the day, I through Rod Dreher's Substack, I came across an article in Tablet magazine. Tablet is a Jewish magazine called The Gen Z Religious Awakening. Subtitle, Young Adults Are Going to Church, Keeping Shabbat, and Even Joining Convents. Is it a hunt for meaning or a rejection of something else? And it's quite an interesting article in a lot of ways, and it touches on things I think we've talked about before, that there's a tendency right now among at least a cohort of younger people to begin returning to religion, but particularly conservative forms of it. Orthodoxy, Catholicism, conservative Anglicanism. Within the Jewish world, there's observant or Orthodox Judaism, even Dalwa into Islam. So these stricter, more demanding forms of religion. And I thought the analysis she provided raised some interesting points, but I thought I would walk us through some parts of the article that I think illuminate some interesting things about culture from a perspective that I at least haven't thought about it.
Yeah.
So we'll start off right on the right toward the introduction. The author says, my age cohort, Gen Z, wasn't supposed to find religion. Boomers had already done much of the hard work of dismantling it, rejecting organized institutions for a spiritual but not religious outlook. Millennials inherited godless spirituality and gave it a self-serving makeover. They substituted church with soul cycle, communion with ayahuasca, and transcendence with self-optimization. And so this is where she sets this up. She sees this as, that Gen Z is coming out of a situation that has, over the boomers and the millennials, or Gen Xers, has sort of systematically dismantled any form of structured religious belief.
Right.
But it's interesting because I'm kind of right in that Gen X territory, and it wasn't so dismantled. At least there were forms of it around. You didn't have yet the Rick Warren and that model of things take over the way it did. That happened right before the whole, if you could mark it this way, millennial kind of group started to be impacted by it. So there was still a memory of older forms of Christian practice that had their roots in of course, traditions that still showed up week in, week out in the church services and the way communities understood themselves. I mean, I remember as a kid growing up in Virginia, every kid in your neighborhood may be going to a different church, but the ones they did still saw themselves somehow as uniquely the better way of Christianity. The Baptists really were still passionate about being Baptist in the Baptist form, and it wasn't just this, it wasn't the beliefs and the practices they still had taken seriously enough to mark themselves and distinguish themselves. And then, I think you increasingly saw with, I think, the millennials in particular, a reiteration of the boomers' distrust in authorities and traditions. And you had a bad allergy there to a lot of, a lot of claims to authority and institutional structures and hierarchies. And some of them were good reasons, other ones were not. But I think with this Gen Z, I think we've had a conversation about this before. You don't necessarily have the same baggage that the millennials had or the boomers had with religion. It's removed enough from them, most of the traditional forms, for a majority, that it's a curiosity, and there are obviously things missing in their life. And these things start to supply or echo towards a need. We're structured in a certain way, and they echo towards a need that the constructed alternatives and the box churches and the like don't quite address.
Yeah. My own experience, I was kind of the, I guess, poster child for the breakdown of things. Grew up in an environment where everybody was seeking, nobody was finding anything but Christianity, ABC, that kind of thing. But I was baptized Episcopalian, and in high church.
Qualifies as ABC in a lot of ways.
What's that?
I said that could qualify as ABC in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah. Well, I was in high church. It was Anglo-Catholic, so I remember a lot of smells and bells as when I was a kid, because I served for a brief time as an altar boy. But my mother was the one who had a taste for that. My father was contemptuous, and he was the college professor and the guy that was the seeker, and he took us all along on his journey. And we ended up eventually in the Church of Scientology, but the trek included the Baha'is, Unitarianism, and Mormonism. So there was just all kinds of weird stuff going on in my childhood, and I was just drug along through it all. So I had I guess, kind of a bewildered kind of take on what was going on. I wasn't necessarily, so I guess maybe I was an early version of this sort of longing for structure and that kind of thing. I remember when I was at Harvard, and we would talk in class about things like this, and I would just look at my classmates incredulously, and I'd say, man, all the stuff that you guys are thinking about and are interested in, I've been there, done that. I don't have any interest in it at all. All the stuff that you guys think is cool, I just think is complete crap.
Well, it's interesting with that, because you are talking about a kind of uprootedness that form of quote unquote seeking is looking for. And it could only happen at certain phases in history and certain conditions, like the American experiment at that time and what was going on. Because, I think, Ratzinger, or the previous Pope Benedict, wrote about this similarly in Europe. The Christian roots and the way in which as people and families could move away, and all these things started to uproot people from kind of what were created givens. Religion becomes one of these. There wouldn't have been something in Europe, for example, of I could pick and become a Mormon. You pretty much were born into and structured around a given, faith. And there wasn't this whole notion of, I'm going to go on a journey and skip through them. That it's one of these things you can pretty much jump in and out of. There's no rootedness in that. The human being is a different conception of the human going on in that view and take towards religion, but that dominated this country and still does in many ways, that religion's something you can try on and put off.
Well, I wonder, though, whether or not things were more stable than we give things credit for being. When I think about the childhood that my parents experienced, it was nothing like mine.
Yeah.
And so I grew up in the '60s and the '70s, so things had already. But I guess my folks, maybe the stuff that people are experiencing now, or maybe in the '90s, the early 2000s, I was kind of like an early, I guess. I don't know, experiment. I kind of saw it firsthand. So, by the time I was 11 years old, my household had fallen apart. I was a ward of the state. And so I grew up around, a lot of weird things, bohemians, drug addicts, uh, people who were the underclass. And I come from a background where, you know, that wasn't the way it was. My parents grew up Episcopalian, for goodness sake, and observant. They actually went to church. It wasn't just a formality. So so anyway, getting back to I'm in a world today where when somebody says I'm deconstructing my faith and they grew up in some kind of homeschooled environment, I just roll my eyes and I just say, you're a complete idiot, you're a loser, you have no idea what's going on. Yeah, I'm sorry that your parents were jerks, but you're not going anywhere. You're not entering into anything that's worth getting into. Maybe your parents did a poor job of raising you or catechizing you, but there's nothing there. What you think is kind of the escape route is just, it's already been tried. There's nothing out there.
Well, I think that's what this article's hitting on. It's been tried and it's found wanting.
Yeah. Let me actually just go to the next paragraph where she gives an assessment of the situation that Gen Z is facing. For a generation raised on iPhones with the illusion of infinite horizons, how to look, who to date, what lifestyle to aspire to, it is no longer enough to outsource the search for meaning to astrology apps and hashtags standing with Ukraine. We're bombarded with endless options, yet given precious few answers. Our culture's spiritual vacancy leaves us with no higher powers to seek clarity. So that's where she sees the generation being. This is why, for me, this is a description of liquid modernity.
Right.
The idea that the modern world, which we've kind of reached probably the terminal point of modernity, but the modern world dissolves all distinctions. It dissolves all boundaries. It removes all, it removes all landmarks, all guideposts. Everything just gets dissolved into this sort of homogeneous stew.
Yeah, that's what I meant by uprootedness. Everything gets pulled out.
Yeah. So she sees that, and now the fact is, she says, Gen Z is still overall pretty irreligious. I mean, they've got less religious commitments than Gen X does, but she says there's a counter movement within Gen Z. And this counter movement is heading toward conservative forms of religion. There's a whole lot of things that we could go through here, but she cites things like the movement toward orthodoxy, the movement toward conservative Catholicism, the movement toward conservative forms of Judaism. All of these kinds of things. And she says, as far as she's concerned, this, it would seem, is a reaction to the utter rootlessness and everything else that's there. They're looking for, well, how does she put it? They're looking for things that emphasize tradition and observance, reverent liturgy, demanding rituals, and a sense of submission rather than self-expression. It's a reaction. It isn't about self-improvement, but surrender. Submitting to something demanding, ache for community. These are all the conviction and discipline. These are all the kinds of things that she is citing as what that generation is actually looking for right now, and why at least this segment of it is gravitating toward these conservative, more rigorous forms of faith.
So does she explore the debate about whether this is just kind of a pendulum swing or an actual return to something substantive.
Yeah, she says, I think if I can kind of bottom line it, I think she would say it's really too soon to tell anything like that. How big this is, it's only a minority of the Gen Z. But the curious thing she says is it may not actually even be about religion. It really may not be about recovering a sense of connection to God or anything like that. It may just be a move to escape from the being totally at sea with your life.
Right.
No fixed points of meaning, no fixed points of anything. This is something that is actually, she suggests, a move toward structure, toward systems of values, toward systems of meaning, toward things that are demanding, toward things that don't require you to invent it yourself.
So in a sense, it still is a search for God because it's, the transcendent horizon. I mean, that's kind of how you look at it in philosophy of religion. Those things have been eclipsed at almost every dimension of their life. It's what we call the secular. And though the secular can't cloud it out completely, there are traces of it. It does come back with these haunts much, much more deeply. And it does appeal to something in us. And it does take different forms. I mean, the millennials kind of took the social justice of their, that form, the kind of imminent, an imminent type of cause and meaning. But here, there's definitely a shift towards a more transcendent horizon, even though it has material aspects of liturgy and practice and form of life and structure. It definitely is connected to a different part of the way we conceive of what is ultimate in God, right? Transcendence.
Well, I think I agree with you, Tom, but I also think that there's kind of an intermediate kind of thing that people might settle for. So, for example, nationalism is a kind of structure. You get a sense of your story, your people, where you belong. Now, it's not enough. Nationalism can become idolatrous, but if you are able to make the connections to the transcendent, if you're able to say, then it could be a stepping stone to something better or deeper or more lasting. That kind of thing.
Well, that's right. Our embodied social life as a nation has theological orientation, and what transcendent is informing it matters. And we see what happens. But that's the thing is like you said, there are dangers there naturally. There are dangers because we do have that side to us, and those things. I mean, just take the classic example of National Socialism. It picked up on those dimensions of ritual and need and symbol that went classically with kind of societies ordered towards its kind of religious consciousness. Right. And yet it was very modern and uprooted in terms of the religious underpinnings that once informed it in Germany. And so that can become, as we've talked about, a very dangerous setup.
Well, let's contrast that, though, with what the French Revolution endeavored to do. It tried to make a God of reason, and it tried to rewrite the calendar, but no one ever went along with it. So there's something about, say, straight socialism or straight communism that in one sense is very powerful, but in another sense lacks the kind of power that, say, National Socialism did and possessed, because there was something stirring about, your identity as a people in a place, blood, soil, as they said. Obviously, this gets back to Rusty's book, The Return of the Strong Gods, basically the things that are demanding and defining. And what are those things? I do think that communism is much more in the spirit of kind of the modern project, in the sense that what you are substituting for a people is a bureaucracy, and something very abstract. I mean, it's something that doesn't really stir your heart unless you're just really full of envy and covetousness. It seems to be or resentment. Anyway.
Yeah, the quote two quotes that stood out to me on the last couple of pages here. The reasons young people give for turning to religion, structure, fellowship, direction, sound more like escapes from modern chaos than declarations of faith.
Yeah.
And then she quotes Liz Buchar, who says, "You can be an atheist and still believe you're not God."
Yeah. Well,
so and that's getting at this idea that we are, we've sort of taught people that they can define themselves, they can basically create their own reality. What they believe is what is real. All of these kinds of crazy ideas coming out of critical theory and some parts of postmodernism and things like that. And again, the idea, this is an escape from that kind of chaos.
Yeah.
So now the question is, now the dangers of things like National Socialism or nationalism and things like that are real. But when the question that immediately comes up to my mind is, okay, if they are in fact turning to these things as escapes from modern chaos rather than as declarations of faith, what does that mean in terms of faith?
Yeah.
Now,
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish.
Let me drop an idea out here. I suspect that worldview rarely changes on the basis of you thinking about it. That what happens is, you could do it through intense study, as long as you're heavily personally engaged and stuff like that. But I think mostly worldviews shift on the basis of what you do much more than what you think. We as Jerry Trousdale, one of my co-authors, once said, you obey your way into new worldviews. So it is quite possible, it seems to me, that by moving into these structured, liturgical, disciplined type approaches to religion, that this could actually not necessarily be a result of faith, but it could produce faith.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And that, you obey your way then into a genuine faith that is, in fact, about a declaration of faith rather than just an escape from chaos.
Yeah, I guess the thing that comes to my mind is legitimacy, or the relative or maybe partial legitimacy of cultural Christianity, mm-hmm. or any kind of cultural religion. Basically, the cult of authenticity that really swept through the American religious scene in the 19th and 20th centuries completely delegitimated the rituals and patterns of cultural Christianity. But that often provided a framework within which people could actually experience the real thing, at some point. It wasn't necessarily a substitute, but it did order society in such a way that at least many of the really terrible vices were restrained. And today those restraints are gone. And you can't bring them back without cultural Christianity, in my mind.
Yeah. Well, my point is, if you commit yourself, let's just look at orthodoxy, because I think it's probably the most intense example we have within the Christian world right now. If you commit yourself to living out as a faithful Orthodox Christian with, 3 or 4 long seasons of fasting, with with weekly divine liturgy and communion and all of the other things that are involved in Orthodox practice, this is going to shape your character. It's going to shape your belief. It's going to shape your faith in ways that I think it would be easy to underestimate as an evangelical, because most evangelicals look at things like that and say, well, it's just ritual.
Yeah, we can't even get people to fast, let alone fast 4 times a year.
Yeah, and for 40 days at a pop.
That's right.
Yeah, that was, Cranmer in the Anglican tradition's whole idea was to bring the kind of monastic practice, and that's what the prayer book is, into your life and structure it. and it does do something very different. You're oriented and immersed, and this is, I guess, the language Sherman. Last name Sherman. I can't remember his first name right now. But when he wrote the book in Kind of Philosophy of Religion about the return to participation. So one of the things he was onto is that all classic forms of philosophy and religion, Christianity included, were participatory through and through. It wasn't just throwing out a set of apologetic ideas that catch in the air and then say, oh, those ideas are so compelling. It was come, taste, and see, that the Lord is good. There was this invitation to share alongside the people of God. And I think these are definitely healthy forms if you can get people to come, taste, and see, and see what is the difference that is going on that marks out these practices in such a way that they're important for people to continue generation after generation to mark their identity. I mean, that is really what the invitation is, the Christian difference, and then the difference it makes in life. And it is interesting that you have young people not just wanting to go have their regular culture affirmed in their religious setting, but actually go and be invited into something that has aspects of culture that precede it and will go on a long time after it, something bigger than them that they can participate in.
Yeah, another quote here. These faiths don't adapt to the age. They expect the age to conform to them.
Yeah.
Their rituals inconvenience, their authorities override preference, their truths don't negotiate. And in a society allergic to absolutes, that refusal to dilute themselves holds a powerful magnetism.
Isn't that a paradox? I mean, what you have is, two statements there that don't seem to it's like a non sequitur. It's like, okay, here we have this culture that celebrates formlessness and really requires everything to become formless, as your allusion to liquid modernity implies. But then there's this other thing that says we're not going to do that. We're going to be what we are, and you need to conform, and the world needs to conform. And then there's magnetism to that, and I think that is really true. I think that one of the things that's going to take a while for evangelicalism to kind of grow out of is the unintended consequences of Fuller seminaries push to contextualize evangelicalism to kind of the American scene, rather than stand against it. It just tried to figure out every possible way to conform to it, with the idea that if we could just hold on to personal piety in the midst of all of it, and the confession that Jesus is my Lord and Savior and lives in my heart, then we're good. That just bleached the Christian faith so much that anybody who's looking for more than a little inner tingle went someplace. And if it's all about the inner tingle, then why not go, I don't know, to some other place that promises a better tingle? That kind of thing.
I actually was at Saddleback Church once. Years and years ago, Chuck Colson and Rick Warren did a worldview curriculum called Wide Angle, and I was sort of the content guy for that. And so I was out at Saddleback, and what I noted is on their campus, they had, I believe it was 13 sites on the campus with, if memory serves, it was 13 sites with 8 different worship styles. You wanted an Irish music worships? We got it. Okay. And it was basically different styles of music, and they would all do their thing, and then they would stop, and you'd get the sermon broadcast into each of the locations from the main center. Okay. That's consumer Christianity. It's consumerism.
It's a couple steps before getting to pick your own gender identity.
There's a continuum here. I think you're actually onto something there, Tom.
Yeah. Very true.
But that is the outgrowth of an application of Fuller. the church growth movement and everything else. This is an application of that.
Yeah, and if you look at what Fuller is today, I mean, it's just a shadow of what it was even in the 80s. And at least in the 80s, you still had some residue of Orthodox Christianity. Today, it's just completely woke and kind of, it's just completely capitulated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I find interesting, I mean, I've thought about this a bit over years. I once, I had, at a 16th century studies conference, I met with and ended up having dinner with Hughes Oliphant Old, who's a really good historical theologian. And he was working on a book, if I remember right, it was on the history of preaching. And he argued at that point that the long expository sermon, which was one of the things that was happening, was going to become a new centerpiece for faith, because this provided the common experience for a community that is otherwise lacking. So he was seeing that as the future of preaching. It didn't exactly work out, to put it mildly. But one of the things I've been thinking about is, the role of that long expository sermon, which you get in a lot of Reformed churches and things like that. Thinking about that in connection with liturgy and the degree of formality in the liturgy, and thinking about both of those in connection with the Lord's Supper. Which really fundamentally gets at what is the nature of what we are doing in our services, our worship on Sunday. And I grew up Catholic, left Catholicism, went into evangelicalism, and didn't want to have anything to do with liturgy because, as far as I'm concerned, it was all just sort of rote stuff. I mean, I could recite most of the Mass by myself as a kid. But it occurred to me, for example, that it could be rote, but there's a lot of good theological depth in a well-written liturgy. And the fact of the matter is, your mind can wander in anything. I mean, tell me that when you've been sitting listening to a long pastoral prayer, that your mind stayed focused on it. I mean, the problem isn't the liturgy. The problem isn't the repetition. The problem is the degree of focus we have. The Lord's Supper. I never entirely appreciated the Lord's Supper until I got into a church that did it weekly.
Right.
And it changes your entire experience of it when you are doing it weekly. All of these kinds of things are things that, were sort of bouncing around in my head as I was reading this, thinking about how what they're saying might apply to the situation that I'm currently in.
Yeah, we live in a day where if you're a communicator, the burden is entirely on you as you communicate to make it, what you're saying as easily digestible as possible and as easy to follow as possible. There's very little emphasis on the role of the listener or the responsibility of the listener to apply himself or herself in the process. And so consequently, we dumb things down, or we make things just so syrupy or easy to sort of conceptually receive without any kind of reflection that, everything is shallow and people are shallow.
Yeah, that's in terms of prayer, one of the things I learned from the Book of Common Prayer is the real benefit of collects.
Yeah.
Short things that expect the congregation to respond. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. Those little short prayers that every time you call them back with the Lord, in your mercy, if their attention wandered, you pull them right back. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm leading the prayers in our church, it's a PCA church, but when I'm leading my prayers, I always do that. Mm-hmm. Because it's it's a way of helping people to refocus their attention.
Well, in the American Black tradition, there's of course a call and response kind of dynamic. Yep. And a preacher fully expects to be talked back to as he's preaching. Yeah. And I've been in some settings where you get kind of the best of both worlds. You really do have a high content and high, sort of like ease of hearing. In other words, you can follow and be carried along quite easily. So it's not an either or, but at the same time, I think that we should be training people or teaching people to come prepared to exercise some effort to hear and receive, not just sort of passively sit there and expect everything to be spoon-fed to you.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, these talks about, these are aspects of participation of different dimensions of what we are. We're not just minds, right? We're embodied souls, and there is a sense in which all of that participates in our worship and in our practice, right? And I think sometimes you know, the way those were understood or got expressed with like Fuller or these different, they were running with these new anthropologies and what they were developing in their cultural studies and everything else with methodologies that imported a lot of interpretation that I don't think has nearly the wisdom that the regular practice of the liturgy in the church has. And this is why you did have great figures like Tom Oden or Jeffrey Wainwright in their work, theological work, of showing exactly what Glenn was talking about, the way in which this addresses the whole person, and much more substantively than some kind of social theory or some kind of contextual theory, to interpret the faith well for us and present it in its fullness. You almost had, you saw it in Bible, the classes of New Testaments, of contextualize, even reading the text in its original context. That's definitely a part of it. First of all, you can't reconstruct the original context, but so far anyway. So if that's the authoritative context, guess what? You don't have much access to it, nor do you have much access to the mind of the author, other than in what they said.
Yeah, but this is the wedge, of course, that the postmodernists use to drive in, you even further away from the text, because they've already discounted the tradition and the commentary of the church and its teaching.
So once that goes,
the
reference.
And so it's just you and the Bible, right?
We've done the same thing.
Yeah.
We do not read we read the text as moderns. We don't read it in the context of the history of the church. Yeah. And again, we've talked about this. The historical grammatical is good stuff, but it's not the only way of doing it, and it's not the way the New Testament authors read the Old Testament.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that a richer sense of what tradition is for the people who've worked hard at it is not an either or. And I think a lot of people are coming to realize that, and younger people find an invitation there with less of the baggage that maybe just a few years ago someone would have towards authority and tradition. Doesn't mean that there aren't people still bothered by those things, and everyone just is jumping in without some kind of reserve. But you do see an attractiveness. Now, I think one thing we've had these conversations a little bit before, but one of the things that's always something we note, especially in contexts like ours, is these sometimes can just be fashions and trends. And when they are fashions and trends, they tend to be, everyone gets excited about them, everyone runs into it. It becomes another aspect of the consumerist, popularist culture. And then it fades away with very little, digging very little roots and having any kind of significant lasting impact. And so there's one sense in which if it's a move of the spirit and it is actually something what I would just call more organic spiritually, where there is a genuine call to those parts of our humanity that have been eclipsed out, and we're starting to see the light get through, because certain aspects of modernity are caving, and they are. And postmodernity doesn't have anything to offer as by way of an alternative, other than, like you say, transhumanism or something, these kind of extended modern projects. Well, then, there might be something that takes, that sinks in a little more, and then you could kind of run with it. And that's different. But if it's a trend, and this is one of the things we, especially the evangelical world, loves to do, they get their big, huge conferences and put, they market it very quickly. And then it becomes, again, one more thing. You get a lot of people out, and then you lose interest, within a short amount of time. So did they address anything like that? Or is this merely just a description of what's kind of going on in the article?
Yeah, it's the article is a description.
Yeah.
It's a description with, like I said, a bit of an interpretation.
Yeah.
The idea that it's an escape from the chaos, as she puts it, of the world. That, I think that there's a credible case to be made for that.
Yeah.
Because, and again, she approaches this from a very ecumenical range.
Yeah.
I mean, she talks about Orthodoxy, she talks about Catholicism. There's one quote here from a 23-year-old former hairdresser who joined a Carmelite monastery without electricity or running water. She said, and I quote, "I figured if I was going to do something crazy for our Lord, I might as well go all in." Yeah. I mean, so that's actually a quote from Plough magazine. But she's positing that it's an escape from chaos.
Yeah.
So was this in Rod?
By the way, she, like I said, it's not just Catholics and Orthodox, it's Judaism. She mentions conversions to Islam, all of which she sees as rigorous approaches to religion.
So you mentioned that you came across this piece in a tablet in Rod Dreher's Substack. Was that the same Substack in which he talked about this community in Denmark? Does that ring a bell?
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, I read that. I don't remember if it was in the same one.
Okay.
But the community in Denmark is right up Rod's alley. I mean,
yeah, but at the same time, it struck me as kind of in the same spirit of this, in the sense that you've got this group of younger Danes who are more or less, it struck me. I didn't get very far in the piece, but it struck me as they were kind of fed up with secularism and just its vacuity, and we're looking for something real, and we're digging down into Christianity in a pretty serious way.
Yeah, and functionally, if I remember right, it's a lot. It's not just digging down into Christianity. They're, for all practical purposes, homesteading.
Yeah,
they're creating a self-sustaining community.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, this brings up the question: can you do what's being described here without doing that as well? Because everything in our society is kind of structured on this kind of seeker-sensitive, sort of liquid modernity, go with the flow, follow your bliss kind of thing. Even at work, you work for, I don't know, Google, and you're still kind of faced with that kind of. Now, of course, they want you to get your work done, and that sort of thing. But apart from that, this is just very narrowly defined utilitarian sort of way of thinking about your life. There's nothing more than that. And so I guess seeing that the larger world has divested itself of its connection to the past, connection to larger, stories and anything meaningful. Can you do this without actually really kind of creating an alternative community?
I don't think so. And one of the things actually she talks about is the importance of community. That's one of the things people are looking for. But the great American heresy is individualism.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a tendency for us, it's certainly in my generation, not to look so much for community, but to look at spiritual growth and things like that as an internal process. It's something you do within yourself. It's your Bible study, it's your prayer time. Maybe you've got a small group, go to church, those kinds of things. But most of it is solitary activity, in practice. They never say that, but in practice, I think that's how it works. And a lot of people I know who are interested in this, want to work on contemplative prayer. They want to do, these kinds of things, all coming back to the individual. But if there's one thing that I think is very clear from history, is that doesn't work. That can lead you into some really bizarre and bad situations. This is done properly and almost exclusively in community. Granted, you've got your hermits, your anchorites, things like that, but they're exceptional people. And some of them get pretty flaky, frankly. But it needs to be done in community. And, well, from what she's saying here, the Gen Zers are recognizing this. So they're joining traditional Latin Mass congregations. They're joining, they're moving into these rather than viewing it as a personal solo activity. Which again, the whole point of this is that they want to get away from you got to do it yourself, you got to invent yourself, you got to do those kinds of things, and that which implies entering into a more communally focused faith.
And I think that the trap there is that, especially in our context, is we think the minute it is said that it is an individual, we mean it's collective, like socialism and communism. Mm-hmm. And Christian society is not reduced to those. Those are actually heretical versions of what true Christian friendship and community is all about. Mm-hmm. It was Christianity came up with Christian social teaching, Christian social teaching and obligation based on the obligations that Christians have towards others, giving others their due, the responsibilities a Christian would have, and they transformed. I mean, look at medicine after Christianity came into the world. Look at the development of hospitals. You could go on and on. Once you rid the world of these things, you begin to see what happens very quickly. And another thing is, I think that we have to remember, especially in Europe and the U.S., you still have, this is what Ratzinger was onto, you still have Christian roots that are there. They're there. They're just way down there. And I think some of these people are digging into that. So especially in Europe, they did shape things for a long amount of time, and reconnecting the things that they do value with that deeper anchor is significant. I think this is what the re-evangelism project of the gospel, which Catholics emphasize, but so do evangelicals, is all about. It isn't about having a new modernist form of Christianity, but it is actually getting a hold of the rich things and showing that they have a capability of addressing us more fully than these, what's been on display and offer.
One of the things that occurs to me, this is going off in a tangent a little bit, but it's related, is that as soon as you start talking in this way, secular people smell cult, and they yeah. and they start and sometimes suspect all kinds of really unhealthy things going on, and to give credit where credit's due. Sometimes there is a bit of that. Where you do have really creepy and controlling people who use these developments to create settings in which they have far more manipulative control over people than they ought to have. Or we fail to spend the time on virtue formation for leaders that would make it possible for them at least to be aware of the dangers of falling into this kind of way of doing things and thinking about themselves. So, I think what you want is community, and you do want authority, because it's impossible to have a community without authority. But at the same time, you also want to have enough self-awareness of the pitfalls and dangers that can occur, that you've got not just self-policing going on, but something going on with the community that is rooted in a lot more than just the personality cult of some guy, who's calling the shots.
Yeah. Well, that's what, a healthy Christian vision would at least try to engage that. That was the whole point of, taking away the divine right of kings, or the other way of putting it is kind of the way, the way a political figure or leader is considered a god. And in previous culture, Christianity comes and dismantles it. Yes, it's ordered by God and respected by God, but it takes on a very different contour, similar to ministers. Ministers are leaders, but not in this kind of, in a Christ kind of way.
I agree with you, Tom, but we all know that there are some guys out there that really think of themselves as prophets.
Well,
that they can't be challenged, that everybody just has to do what they say. And anybody who dares to call what they've said into question is immediately, you know, dismissed as someone who is, trying to lay a hand on God's anointed, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think those forms of church structure are problematic anyway. And I know they can creep into any, but on the whole, there are some forms that don't quite have that as their issue. But so yeah, it depends on what they're up to and the kind of spiritual leaning of these communities. But there are renewals of like the local parish. I mean, you're seeing a lot of the kind of all the local stuff and a lot of things merge together to form these. But they are, I think, trying to dig out a space to not have the.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting as what this is my take, for what it's worth. I think we need a traditionalism and a commitment to Christian culture that accepts the fact that there's going to be a lot of messiness and a lot of failure. Mm-hmm. And that's just because we live in a fallen world. It's not intrinsic to say, a particular movement. It's just kind of reality. Right. You get my drift.
Yeah. Well, I'd add one thing here too, and that is this is where ecclesiology sort of matters.
Yeah.
You're much more likely to get the cult of personality thing in a congregational polity, where there is no hierarchical structure that is overseeing the ministers. And I'm saying that as someone whose ordination was done in a congregational church. I mean, there should be, it seems to me, some kind of accountability structure for pastors, whether that's a regional group where they just sort of mutually watch each other and interact, or whether it's an Episcopal system or a Presbyterian system. Something needs to be in place to prevent that kind of cult of personality from taking off. And the problem is, once you accept the idea that the congregation is independent of any other body, it's very hard to make that happen.
Right. And sometimes people who start off well finish badly.
Yep.
That's what corruption's all about, isn't it? I mean, you can start off on a good trajectory, but at some point along the way, a choice is made, and you end up in a very different place than you would have ended up otherwise.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. I mean, that's just one, that's one example. But the others are, don't look like that. They're just people going back to forms that have held their sway through modernity and still have not been absorbed in it. A lot of classic forms of Christianity, and these have an appeal. And people, it is defining and shaping lives, even if they're not moving into, these kind of Benedict communities and the like.
But that's a great point, Tom. I mean, we're not talking about a leader. We're talking about a tradition. We're talking about a liturgy or a particular tradition. Right?
Yeah.
So I think that, like I said, I find the analysis here really interesting because it points to what, a lot of people have commented on, Rod Dreher talks about the number of young people showing up at the Chartres pilgrimage, for example, huge numbers of people. We've talked about conversions to Orthodoxy and all of these other, conservative Anglicanism, all of these other kinds of groups. But I think, though, that the author of the article, Annie Wilczynski, I may not be pronouncing that right. I think, though, that she is onto something about part of the appeal of this. I've always talked about it in terms of rootedness, finding some sort of anchor point. But her analysis of it as sort of a reaction to chaos, more than necessarily a move to faith, is, I think, interesting, worth considering, and not necessarily a bad thing. Because if we understand that may be the dynamic that's at work here, at work, at play with at least some of the Gen Z people. It gives us an idea about how to approach them.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm in a situation where I've got a church filled with young people, young marrieds and so forth. I was just told a couple days ago that we have 78 children under the age of 7 in my church. So
that's one way of growing the congregation.
Yeah. In fact, I think that's a whole other topic for another show. Just the either or that people have in mind when it comes to either biological or conversion growth, and we're seeing both. But I think that biological growth has been more or less for the last, at least over the course of my ministry, dismissed as not legitimate. I mean, almost put in those terms. It's not real evangelism, in other words.
Yeah.
But I guess this phenomenon of younger people, I see it across the country. I know you guys travel; you probably see it too. The churches I go to are just packed. Now, I know that that's not true across the board. I know that there are many evangelical churches that are shriveling and dying, and not to mention the main line. And it sounds like this gal in this article is noting that this is not, broadly the case. This is just, there's a particular phenomenon that she's zeroed in on that is a minority, but it's still significant, and hopefully it will grow.
Yeah. So I guess we're running short on time here. I guess one of the things that I'd like to at least think about, again, is where I was just pointing. What are the implications for us as we think about evangelism, as we think about Gen Z and so on? And like I said, I think that it starts with the realization that there is a desire to move away from chaos, away from the pressures of self-definition, the pressures of inventing everything yourself, which it seems to me, I think I've said this before, but the critical theory idea that you need to develop your own identity without recourse to tradition, family, or anything else is, it seems to me, the scariest thing I've ever heard. I mean, just sort of leaves you free floating in the middle of space. So seeing this as a response to that, I think it opens up some interesting windows for how to approach people in that generation, whether in our communities, in universities, anywhere else we run into them.
Yeah. I'm tracking with you completely. I think that we need to be, in a place we need to be telling people this is the way, not just where do you want to go, but saying this is the way, a return to a kind of, an authoritative and confident apostolic ministry.
And it does also I'm in a liturgical church, and it does help me in ministry focus on making connections with the liturgy to that very issue, like with baptism, explaining the way this precedes you. This marks an identity. I mean, this is how early Christians fundamentally, this is renouncing the old identity, putting on the new, these aspects of the self that are not kind of hidden inside or merely structured as a social role, but relational through and through, and these things precede, just like creation precedes us. So does new creation. And that
you mean the world was here before I was born, Tom?
Yeah.
Amazing.
We didn't get to speak it into being.
Chris, it also doesn't disappear when you fall asleep.
Wow, that's incredible.
Now for Berkeley, it might have.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, anything you want to wrap up with here, Glenn? We're getting to the point.
I just gave my wrap up.
Okay, great. Well, Anything you want to say, Tom, to put a cherry on top?
No, I think I've said enough. It's an interesting trend happening, and I think we've all known it. Well, we hope some of it would show up sooner or later. I think there's a lot of advantages to it, but to measure it, I'm not sure yet how to do that.
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you the sociologists who study this will tell you that there isn't really a sign of a massive groundswell of return to religion. I mean, she points out Gen Z is more irreligious than the Gen Xers are, but there is this counter movement. Yeah,
the wheat and the tares, they grow together, as they say, as things get better and worse at the same time. Anyway, well, we hope that you enjoyed this conversation, and we're really pleased that you made it all the way to the end. We do have a way for you to help us out in our work, and we hope you would consider it. We have a Patreon page, and if you haven't checked it out yet, there's a link in the show notes, and we encourage you to do that. We really could use your help. We're running about $100 to $150 short every month in terms of paying the bills. So if there are some folks out there who would say to themselves, you know what, I've been listening to this show for a while, and I've gotten a lot out of it. I'd like to make a contribution. Well, there you go. I just think, 3 or 4 or 5 people would be able to make up that difference. We don't even talk about this kind of stuff very much. We're very much a kind of let it take care of itself, ministry and podcast. And that's been working for us over the years. Just here recently, though, we did a little quick accounting and we realized, this is what's happening. So if you could help us out, that would be appreciated. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Battleground, Washington. The Theology Pugcast is produced and edited by Wiley Craft Productions of Nashville, Tennessee.